What if everything you ever loved vanished in a single moment? Your home, your family, your security. In the year 1893, a young boy, just 12 years old, found himself standing alone in a world that suddenly felt cold and unkind. His name was Hans Wilsdorf. After losing both his parents, he had no one to lean on, no mother's warmth, no father's guidance. He was orphaned, broken, forgotten. And then, something worse happened. The little money he had inherited from his parents was stolen. At just 12 years old, he had lost everything, but there was one thing no one could steal from him: his passion, a quiet obsession for something others found ordinary. Watches. That passion would become his light in the darkest of tunnels, because what Hans built from nothing would go on to become not just a brand, but a legacy, a symbol of excellence, a name the world would never forget: Rolex. But before Rolex became a legend, Hans Wilsdorf had to walk through storms. This is not just a story about watches. This is a story of resilience, of heartbreak, of brilliance born in silence. This is the untold story of a boy who had every reason to quit, but chose instead to build time. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Germany in 1881, into a family that ran a prosperous business. As a child, he had everything a boy could ask for: love, comfort, a promising future. But fate had other plans. By the time he turned 12, both of his parents were gone. The foundation of his world had crumbled. Imagine being 12 years old and realizing that the people who gave you life are never coming back. Hans was no longer someone's son. He was now an orphan. His relatives quickly sold off his parents' business, and instead of a warm home, they sent him away to a boarding school, a place filled with strange faces, and no familiar voice to comfort him when the nights got too long. But there, amidst the loneliness, something unusual happened. Hans became friends with a boy from Switzerland, and this boy unknowingly changed his destiny. He introduced Hans to the Swiss watchmaking industry, a world of gears, precision, and beauty. To most, it was just a conversation, but to Hans, it was a calling. In his quiet moments at school, he began sketching watch designs. He was fascinated by the idea that time, something so powerful, could be captured inside something so small. Others laughed. They said he was a dreamer, that he should focus on real life. But Hans had already lost everything. He had nothing left to fear. And when fear leaves the heart, courage moves in. At age 19, he made a decision that would change his life forever. With a few saved coins and a heart full of ambition, Hans packed his bags and left Germany. Destination: Switzerland, the land of watches, the place where his dream, his hope, would begin to take shape. Switzerland welcomed Hans with open skies, snow-capped mountains, and unanswered questions. He was just 19 years old, standing in a new land, carrying only two things: a small bag, and a dream too big to fit inside it. He had come to Switzerland hoping to build a life, but life had another test waiting for him. Not long after arriving, the 3,300 German gold marks he had inherited from his parents, his only money, were stolen. Every last coin, gone. Hans was devastated, alone in a foreign country, no money, no friends, and once again, no safety net to fall back on. For most people, that would have been the end, a final blow. But for Hans, it became the beginning. He believed that losing everything doesn't mean you're finished, it means you've been given a blank page. And he was ready to write something the world had never read before. He knocked on doors. He walked streets. Eventually, he found work at a small Swiss watch company called Kuhne Korten. It wasn't a fancy job. He was asked to inspect hundreds of watches every day, checking each one for accuracy. Day in, day out. It was exhausting, repetitive, but Hans didn't see it as a boring job. He saw it as training. With every tick of every watch, he was learning how time works, what makes it precise, and how to spot perfection in imperfection, where others just saw gears and dials. Hans saw art, science, and soul. He didn't just want to sell watches, he wanted to create the world's most trusted timepiece. And so, with quiet determination, Hans worked. He studied the smallest movements. He asked questions no one else bothered to ask. And slowly, his dream, once fragile and distant, started to feel possible. But there was still one more journey to take. One more city that would shape his destiny. London. The next chapter of his story was waiting across the sea. It was the early 1900s. Hans Wilsdorf left Switzerland and stepped into a new city. London, the heart of the British Empire. A city filled with energy, opportunity, and uncertainty. He had no contacts, no network, just a belief: I will not work to survive. I will build something that outlives me. In London, Hans joined a watch company, this time, not as a technician, but in the sales and marketing department. It was a completely new world. He wasn't dealing with gears anymore. He was now dealing with people, what they want, what they notice, and what they truly value. He started asking questions others ignored. Why do some watches sell while others don't? Why do customers care more about style than precision? And most importantly, what makes a watch feel like a part of someone's identity? Over time, Hans realized something big. Most companies were obsessed with fancy, decorative watches, but customers weren't looking for decoration. They were looking for something different: accuracy, durability, simplicity, elegance. Hans saw a gap, and he decided to fill it. In 1905, at the age of just 24, Hans Wilsdorf took his biggest leap yet. He started his own company, Wilsdorf and Davis, with his brother-in-law, who provided the capital. Their vision? To create affordable, reliable, and stylish watches, especially for travelers. This was the age of trains, buses, steamships, and watches weren't just fashion, they were survival tools. Hans designed his first product, the Portfolio pocket watch, small, accurate, and portable. It was wrapped in premium leather, and marketed not just as a timepiece, but as a companion for people on the move. The watch became an instant success, but deep down, Hans knew this was just the beginning, because he had a vision, a quiet, bold prediction, that one day, pocket watches would disappear, and something new would take their place: wristwatches. Everyone thought he was crazy. Wristwatches were seen as a feminine accessory, not something a real man would wear. But Hans wasn't trying to follow the world. He was trying to lead it, and that meant doing something no one had done before. The foundations of Rolex were about to be laid. By 1905, Hans Wilsdorf had created a successful watch business. But he wasn't satisfied. He didn't just want to make good watches. He wanted to make a global symbol, a name that stood for precision, quality, and elegance. But here's the problem: most watch companies at the time used long, complicated names. Names that were hard to remember, and even harder to pronounce. Hans wanted the opposite. A name that was short, universal, easy to say in any language, and elegant enough to fit beautifully on the face of a watch. So, he got to work. He played with letters, combined syllables, wrote hundreds of variations. He even claimed one day that the name just came to him, like a whisper in the wind. That name was Rolex. Simple, sophisticated, strong. He registered the brand in 1908, and just like that, a legend was born. But Hans wasn't done. He didn't just want to change the name, he wanted to change the entire culture around watches. At the time, wristwatches were not popular, especially among men. They were seen as delicate, even feminine. But Hans saw what others didn't. In Britain, both men and women loved wearing bracelets. That was his insight. What if the wristwatch could be designed to look like a bracelet? Something elegant, stylish, and powerful. He introduced gold and silver wristwatches, with metallic straps instead of leather. But here's the genius part: he didn't market them as wristwatches. He called them bracelet watches. The public loved them. Suddenly, wristwatches weren't just for women. They became fashionable for men too, especially among the elite. Slowly, but surely, the tide was turning. Rolex was gaining ground. The name started appearing in high society circles. It was no longer just a product. It was becoming a status symbol. And Hans Wilsdorf, the orphan boy with nothing, was now a rising name in a powerful world. But just as his vision was taking shape, the world itself was about to change forever. By 1914, Hans Wilsdorf had built something extraordinary. Rolex was no longer just a company. It was a growing name across Europe. Hans had set up offices, built a team of over 60 people. Sales were strong, momentum was real. And then, war. World War I exploded across the globe, and with it came chaos. Governments were desperate to raise money. So the British government imposed a heavy 33% export tax on luxury goods, including watches. Just like that, Rolex became 33% more expensive than its competitors. Sales collapsed, months of progress vanished overnight, and once again, Hans was cornered. For the second time in his life, everything he had worked for was under threat. But Hans didn't panic. He adapted. He moved Rolex from London to Switzerland, the home of watchmaking, and a neutral ground during the war. It meant starting over. New country, new regulations, new struggles. But Hans had learned something powerful. When you can't control the storm, build a stronger ship. In Switzerland, he doubled down on his dream, to create the most accurate wristwatch movement in the world. Until now, Rolex had been importing movements. But Hans wanted control. So he studied horology, the science of time. He traveled, met master watchmakers, learned everything. Eventually, he created Rolex's first in-house movement, the 15-line caliber 200. He sent it to the official chronometer testing institute in Switzerland, the most prestigious testing lab for timepieces. The result? Rolex became the first wristwatch in the world to receive the coveted chronometer certificate. It was official. Rolex had the most accurate wristwatch on the planet, in the middle of a war-torn world. Hans had given people something they could still rely on: time. Rolex's reputation soared. It was now being sold across Europe, not as a fashion statement, but as a guarantee, a promise that no matter how chaotic the world gets, time will keep ticking. By the mid-1920s, Rolex was respected, trusted, but Hans Wilsdorf didn't just want trust. He wanted to redefine what a watch could be. There was still one major flaw in wristwatches: water. A little moisture, a splash, even humidity, and the inside of a watch could rust, break, or stop altogether. Hans wanted to fix that. He studied every watch design in the world. He noticed that most watches used a snap-on casing, like a lunchbox, simple, fast, and vulnerable. That's when he had an idea. What if a watch could be sealed, like a submarine? So Hans and his engineers designed a revolutionary new case. It screwed tightly shut instead of snapping. It used grooves and rubber rings to keep out moisture. The crown, the part you wind the watch with, was sealed tight like a hatch. It was a bold, complicated design, but it worked. In 1926, Rolex released the world's first waterproof watch, the Rolex Oyster. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a watch that could survive rain, spills, even a swim. But now came the bigger challenge. How do you prove to the world that your watch is truly waterproof? Hans found the answer in a swimmer. Her name was Mercedes Gleitze, a young British athlete who claimed to be the first woman to swim across the English Channel. Her story was already dramatic, but Hans made it historic. He offered her a Rolex Oyster to wear around her neck, while she swam through icy water for over 10 hours. When she finally emerged from the sea, exhausted and freezing, she had failed to finish the swim. But the Rolex Oyster? It was still ticking. Not a drop of water inside, not a second lost. Hans now had his proof, and he turned it into marketing genius. He bought newspaper ads featuring Mercedes and the Rolex. He displayed oysters inside aquariums and store windows, surrounded by real swimming fish. It was bold, beautiful, unforgettable, and it worked. The world took notice. Rolex wasn't just a watch anymore. It was a statement that even in a storm, even underwater, time can keep going. Hans Wilsdorf had once been a boy robbed of everything. Now, he had created something no one could take away. After the triumph of the Rolex Oyster, Hans Wilsdorf had every reason to slow down. He had already changed watchmaking forever. But he wasn't chasing praise. He was chasing perfection. There was still one flaw left in watches. You had to manually wind them every few days. And if you forgot, the watch would stop. Time would stop. And for Hans, that wasn't acceptable. So he asked the question no one else was asking. What if the watch could wind itself? It took years of trial and error. But finally, in 1931, he unveiled his greatest invention yet, the perpetual rotor. A semicircular weight inside the watch that rotated as you moved your wrist, winding the mainspring automatically, so the watch never stopped. It was silent, elegant, revolutionary. And with that, the Rolex Oyster Perpetual was born. A watch that never needed to be wound by hand again. Once again, Rolex had done what no one else could. And Hans Wilsdorf? He was no longer just an inventor. He was a legend. But just when everything seemed perfect, the world broke again. In 1939, the shadow of World War II fell across Europe. Factories shut down, supplies dried up, the economy collapsed. Once again, Hans saw his business suffer, but even in wartime, Rolex kept serving. They made watches for soldiers and airmen, strong, accurate, and reliable. Many prisoners of war wore Rolex watches with pride, believing that time was the only freedom they had left. Hans even allowed POWs to order Rolex watches on credit, trusting they would pay once the war ended. And they did, because Rolex wasn't just a watch anymore. It had become a symbol of honor, trust, and survival. But amid this global chaos, Hans faced a personal tragedy. In 1944, he lost the love of his life, his wife. After everything, this loss was different, deeper, quieter. For a time, Hans disappeared from the public eye, but he didn't give up. He turned his grief into purpose. And in 1945, the year Rolex turned 40, Hans gave the world yet another innovation, the Rolex Datejust, the first automatic watch to show the date on the dial, and later, a magnifying lens so it could be read clearly. Another quiet revolution, another step forward, because for Hans Wilsdorf, there was no finish line, just time, and the will to make it meaningful. By the 1950s, Rolex was no longer just a watch, it was an institution. On mountaintops, beneath the ocean, on the wrists of explorers, pilots, presidents, and pioneers, Rolex was everywhere. In 1953, Rolex released the Explorer, designed for adventurers who scaled Mount Everest. In 1955, the GMT Master was born, made for airline pilots traveling across time zones. In 1960, the Deep Sea Special was tested, nearly 11,000 meters below the ocean's surface. Even there, under crushing pressure, the watch survived, ticking, perfect, unstoppable, just like the man who created it. Hans Wilsdorf had spent a lifetime chasing one thing, excellence, and he had caught it. But even legends run out of time. In 1960, at the age of 79, Hans Wilsdorf passed away, quietly, peacefully, but he didn't leave behind a will. He left behind a legacy. He had already created the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, and ensured that Rolex would live on, not for profit, but for purpose. A company built on principles, not just prestige. Today, Rolex remains one of the most respected, admired, and desired brands in the world. And yet, the story behind it all is rarely told. The story of a boy who lost everything, but never gave up. A man who faced betrayal, loneliness, war, and heartbreak, but kept going. A man who didn't just build watches. He built a reminder that every second of life matters. That time is not just for measuring minutes, but for making meaning. So the next time you see a Rolex, don't just think about luxury, don't just think about wealth, think about the boy who had nothing and built a legacy that even time could not erase. Hans Wilsdorf, a man who didn't wear time on his wrist, he wore it in his soul. This was the true story of Rolex, a story of resilience, vision, and legacy. If you were moved by this journey, subscribe to Life of Hope, where stories aren't just told, they're remembered. Thank you for watching.